All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're building a masterclass on a concept that truly separates good chess players from great ones: understanding pawn weaknesses. We're not talking about flashy tactics today. Nope, we're going deep into the very architecture of the game. So, what does a quote like this actually mean? Well, it means the real battle, the one that truly matters, isn't always about that immediate, flashy checkmate thread. The real advantage? It's often built silently, move by move, deep in the structure of the position itself. Most players get stuck just searching for quick hits, a fork here, a pin there. But strong players, they're looking at the board through a completely different lens. They are scanning for permanent, long-term targets. And that is the exact mindset shift we are making today. Okay, section 1. To find those long-term targets, you first have to understand the foundation of any chess position. And what's that foundation built with? It's built with pawns. You can think of them as the skeleton of the game. This right here, this is probably the most important rule to remember about pawn structure. Every single time you push a pawn, it's a permanent commitment. It's a one-way street. Sure, it can create strengths, but it always leaves something behind: a weakness, a hole, a change that can be exploited for the rest of the game. All right, let's dive into our first major structural weakness, the isolated pawn. This is easily one of the most common and instructive weaknesses you're ever going to face over the board. An isolated pawn has no friends, no neighbors to protect it. Now sure, in the middle game it can help with an attack, but as the game goes on and pieces start coming off the board, this little guy often becomes a huge, glaring liability. Now, here's the crucial part. You don't just rush in and try to win the pawn. That's a mistake. Strong players follow a very methodical plan. And look at this. Winning the pawn is the last step. First, you improve your own pieces. Then you lock that pawn down with a blockade. Then you slowly turn up the heat. The real goal is to use that weakness to paralyze your opponent's entire position before you even think about cashing in. And why a knight? Think about it. Once a knight plants itself right in front of that isolated pawn, no enemy pawn can ever kick it away. It creates a permanent outpost. From there, it controls key squares and basically forces the opponent into the passive defense of their own weak pawn. Okay, let's move on to our next two weaknesses. These are often even more static and even more difficult for your opponent to deal with. We're talking about doubled and backward pawns. When you've got two of your own pawns stuck on the same file, they just get clumsy. They can't defend each other, they get in the way of your own rooks, and they present a super clear, inflexible target for your opponent to attack. And what's really cool here is the strategy. You don't just attack these pawns randomly. The key is to target the front pawn. So in this position, if you can stop that front pawn on c4 from ever moving, then the pawn behind it on c5 is handicapped forever. The whole structure becomes a chronic, long-term headache for black. Now for what I think is the most subtle and often most powerful pawn weakness of them all, the backward pawn. This is a pawn that's fallen behind its buddies and can no longer be protected by them. It's just a sitting duck. This position shows the real problem perfectly. It's not just that the pawn on d6 is weak. No. Look at the square right in front of it, d5. That square has become a permanent hole, a beautiful outpost for white's pieces. It's a gap in the position that can never be fixed, letting you plant a piece deep inside enemy territory. Okay, this brings us to the absolute heart of this whole masterclass. We've identified these pawn weaknesses, but now we need to understand what we're really fighting for. Because if you're just focused on winning that one little pawn, you're missing the entire point. The material is just a symptom of a much, much deeper positional problem. And this is the breakthrough moment. This is when you go from thinking like an intermediate player to thinking with real positional understanding. The goal isn't always to capture the pawn. The real goal is to control the weak squares that the pawn creates. Let's look at this diagram. Black has that backward pawn on d6. A beginner might just think, okay, how can I attack that pawn? But a strong player sees the real prize, the d5 square. White's knight on c3, its dream in life is to get to that glorious outpost on d5. And once it lands there, it can't be challenged by a pawn. It'll dominate the whole board. White might never even capture the d6 pawn because controlling the d5 square is, all by itself, a winning advantage. So here's the thing. Strong players don't just sit around and wait for these weaknesses to pop up. They actively provoke them. And their number one tool for doing this is called the pawn break. A pawn break is basically a pawn move that challenges your opponent's pawn structure head-on. So for example, here, if black plays c5, it forces white to make a tough choice. Does white capture on c5 and maybe fix block structure? Or does white push past with d5 and maybe create weaknesses in their own camp? Either way, you're forcing them to damage their own architecture. And while you're trying to create weaknesses for them, you have to avoid making them yourself. So, two big things to watch out for. First, what I call capture fever. Before you trade pieces, always ask, does their recapture actually help them fix their bad pawns? Second, avoid panic pawn pushes. When you're under attack, it's tempting to just lash out with your pawns. Don't. Defend with your pieces. Pushing pawns creates permanent holes you can never take back. So how do we actually put all this together and use it to get better? Well, it takes a whole new way of looking at the board. Here's a really powerful training method for you. Pull up one of your old games, but this time, I want you to ignore all the pieces. I mean it. Just look at the pawn skeleton. Whose structure is better? Where are the weaknesses? Once you've figured that out, then put the pieces back in your mind. All of a sudden, the best squares for your pieces will become crystal clear. It's like magic. And that is the final crucial takeaway. The next time you sit down to play a game, I want you to try to consciously shift your thinking. Don't just hunt for tactics. Instead, ask yourself this fundamental question. Look at the architecture, find the flaw in their foundation, and I promise you, you will find the path to victory.